Good day, I'm Primavera Fisogni, Italian journalist and PhD in Metaphysics. I'm really honored to be a speaker of the International Conference on Neurology and Spine Disorders. My speech is about pandemic fatigue as a self-exhaustion of the human person, a systemic perspective. Well, I'm going to read my paper. Pandemic fatigue has become a popular term in everyday speech since the World Health Organization coined it in March 2020, when the pandemic outbreak kept shattering our lives. In a wide sense, pandemic fatigue could be interpreted as the most contagious side effect of COVID-19 because it affects also those who have not infected by the pathogen. So it is even much viral, if possible, than the virus in itself. Although a basic definition of pandemic fatigue has been sketched and people easily grasp the semantic roots of pandemic fatigue, any effort for defining it immediately shows its limits because of the multifaceted profile of the phenomenon. For melting together both physical symptoms like fatigue or difficulty in carrying out the operation of life, also the simplest operation, pandemic and psychological traits like stress, melancholy, depressive states, pandemic fatigue would be better understood as an existential syndrome. The aim of this paper is to move from the definition provided by WHO to the systemic processes that lie beneath pandemic fatigue in order to clarify the topic, not by telling what it is, but in order to focus on how it works. From a theoretical perspective, well, I'm a philosopher. This means a change of paradigm, precisely a turn from the linear thinking definition to systemic thinking processes. A short account of this philosophical approach is due. According to general system thinking, objects and events are considered in terms of open systems. It means that they are not mere aggregations or sums of parts, but primarily they are dynamic units to which pertain qualities that depend upon many interactions and processes, internal or external to the system, within the frame of a continuous exchange with the environment that give rise to systemic properties. We can speak of an ordered, of interrelated processes that depends on the characteristics of the part and on the web of their interconnections. Each system, then, might be explained as a simple and complex unit that interacts with the whole. Nevertheless, the idea of system is not really new, especially for sciences, since that first systemic, the general system thinking approach proved to be able to fit a variety of topics about which linear thinking and reductionist approaches have generally revealed unable to provide responses. It should be also noted that, according to general system thinking, traditional conceptual frame could be relaunched, while new terms derived from biology or computational sciences have been forked and successfully applied. Through the lenses of systemic thinking, I'm going to argue that pandemic fatigue is the result of the interactions among system, subsystem, macro and micro environments, so that it could be properly speak for pandemic fatigue in terms of systemic property. Before moving into the dynamics of pandemic fatigue, I will highlight on 3 essential traits that identify such a tangled existential phenomenon. The first one, pandemic fatigue, belongs to the domain of fatigues. Secondly, it presents a familiarity with chronic diseases or conditions. And third, it makes concrete the borderline experience of the void. Systemic at heart, the notion of fatigue is described as an overwhelming feeling of tiredness and exhaustion that affects in a pathological way a wide number of diseases, neurological, as well psychological, mental. It may be described as a predictor of psychiatric discomfort or disorders. Fully understood, despite its broad diffusion, fatigue needs always to be carefully examined because it depends on a number of causes, multiple causes. For example, in multiple sclerosis, a link between fatigue and sleep disturbance has been proved. Persistent fatigue also occurs in psychiatric disorders, comorbidly. Fatigues enter the coronavirus pandemic frame in 2 ways: as a listed symptom of COVID-19 and as a consequence of a prolonged exposure of the individual to the outbreak. This second trait was brought to light in March 2020 by the World Health Organization that coined a prior definition for the phenomenon, and the motivation to follow recommended protective behaviors, emerging gradually over time and affected by a number of emotions, experiences, and perceptions. Thus, since the very beginning of pandemic, this type of behavioral fatigue associated with a close adherence to COVID-19 restrictions, although an expected and natural response to prolonged public health crisis, has been immediately felt as a part of the problem, in virtue of the systemic interactions with society, social rule, preventing measures. Pandemic fatigue, not to be confused with the psychological and physical fatigue felt in the post-illness phase, combines both the motivational decline and the condition of burnout, the sense of exhaustion primarily due to the implementation of invasive measures with unprecedented impacts on daily lives of everyone, including those who have not been directly affected by the virus itself. Among existential fatigues strictly related to chronic situation, I recall, for example, AIDS fatigue and combat fatigue, which present also commonalities with pandemic fatigue. AIDS fatigue is related to desensitization to the safe issues for preventing AIDS after receiving continual messages about the danger over a long period of time, and combat fatigue is due to a prolonged exposure to the stress of a conflict. For AIDS and coronavirus, the metaphor of war has been recurrent. in the discourse. Furthermore, I wish to underline how many aspects of COVID-19 fatigue are superimposable to the concentration camp fatigue, passivity, difficulty in coping with the simplest operation of life, lack of attention, a sense of isolation, well noted by Etty Hillesum, the Dutch intellectual who died in Auschwitz in 1943 after having spent 1.5 years in Westerbork camp. The prolonged exposure to a frustrating situation within the frame of strict rule due to the threat of being attacked by an enemy in a conflict, as well as in the concentration camp and in pandemic outbreak as well, is going to limit the life space of the individual. Such a condition has been widely experimented for several times during the repeated lockdowns that occurred worldwide. A continual self-isolation reinforces the systemic discomfort of the human subject. Differently from the physical fatigue experimented as a physiological reaction of the body, which lasts until the organism is restored, pandemic fatigue is an effort that cannot be fully released. The existential state of distress is also often related to the experience of void. It's a loss that depends on grief and sorrow in many cases, a waste of energy that should be carefully taken in consideration before framing the process of the phenomenon. After having sketched just few lines of the phenomenological aspects of this tangled phenomenon, I wish to move into the dynamics in order to sketch some trait of the processes. We are now in the condition to move into the processes that lie beneath this condition. From a phenomenological point of view, which is highly revealing of the phenomenon in itself, it has been noted that there is a link between this peculiar fatigue and the self-exhaustion of the individual. Loss of motivation, lack of concentration, sense of isolation, waste of energy, loss of beloved ones are part of the problem and a fruitful point of departure into the systemic investigation. I will focus on 4 processes: perturbation, dissipation, emergence, and coherence. The first dynamic to be explored is perturbation. Perturbation is the process that derives from a shock inflicted on a living organism. Death is for living individuals the highest grade of this kind of shock. Pandemic outbreak shattered our fragile social balance, and the microscopic pathogen assaulted the world, basically unprepared to cope with such a traumatic upset. When a perturbation occurs, it is properly the balance of the system to be fractured. In the case of chronic situation, the general instability is amplified. The long-term unpredictability in physical dynamics, as well as in fluid dynamics, two domains from which systemic thinking borrowed the term perturbation, is the typical behavior of deterministic or non-deterministic chaos. This dynamic step could be found just at the beginning of the pandemic fatigue phenomenon. It corresponds precisely to the exposure to the outbreak. The never-ending red alert about the pathogen spreading reinforces the instability of the person, making all its function more vulnerable. I move to the second process, with dissipation, a term that systemic thinking has received from the dissipative structure introduced in thermodynamics by the Nobel Prize Ilya Prigogine. A double simultaneous movement occurs. It is characterized by the coexistence of change and stability. This process is strictly related to perturbation because it originates in non-equilibrium conditions. That's to say, in systems where a shock gave rise to instability. In classic thermodynamics, typical movement of dissipative system is rooted in the ability to transfer a large amount of energy to the environment. It is properly the production of entropy to guarantee the stability of such systems. And it's properly in the process of releasing energy that new configuration or emergent properties develop and reach the surface of the dynamics. The attribute dissipative refers to systems where energy dissipation in non-equilibrium condition allows the emergence of ordered structures. Well, this step corresponds in the phenomenological description of pandemic fatigue to the symptoms of distress suffered both physically and mentally by the individuals. If fatigue is a physiological reaction of the body to an effort, find its balance very quickly through the rest of the organism, differently, the exposure to a chronic stress originates a non-transient state of exhaustion. To figure out a similar phenomenon of a non-living structures may be suggested the image of a vortex in a flux of running water, or we can recall atmospheric phenomena like hurricanes. Well, dissipation is in a certain sense a process that focuses on the very heart of fatigue. Unlike the almost negative vision with which fatigue is perceived, this process suggests a flourishing of the individual. Yes, a flourishing. In fact, it calls for the reaction of the whole system, physical as well as spiritual, and also psychological and existential at large. In this perspective, the loss of hope that seems so frequent in pandemic fatigue should be replaced by a positive thought. In fact, a new coherence is going to be built throughout self-exhaustion. The self-organization of dissipative system is at the origin of the emergencies or systemic properties or second-type systemic properties which result from the interactions within systems and between systems and environments. Emergencies should be seen as continuous and irregular but coherent, dynamically correlated, variable in the acquisitions of new structures and non-equivalent processes of self-organization. Pandemic fatigue, as well as fatigue in general, dwells exactly this place in the interplay among systems. The difficulty to define pandemic fatigue or fatigue in general depends upon the reason that it cannot be reduced to a symptom, nor it can belong to the sole physical or psychological or mental domain. It surpasses all of them, although being deeply interwoven with both. Another consequence of self-organization of perturbed systems as pandemic fatigue is the search for a coherence. This phase supports the unitary and integrated response of the system to the disturbances, to the perturbations, avoiding isolation, or the independent organization of some parts or functions. The loss of coherence clarifies why a process of emergence may be extinguished as the consequence of an inconsistent organization. This process is visible in the social response to the pandemic outbreak. It corresponds on the social environment to the immunization process of the organism. It is an effort of the whole person, a challenge of transformation, adaptation. When people was locked down in order to avoid the spreading of the virus, people had to live abruptly apart, jobs, daily activities, interpersonal relations, and relatives, friends. Despite these changes, life was going, although individuals were forbidden to leave their houses. People continued to work at home through the connection with their offices, connected with the colleagues on a video chat. Online educational portals gave children the possibility to feel once again at school. We could go shopping through specific digital networks. As an effort, although a positive way to cope with the major shock, this phase asks for a deep interplay with the environment because it is properly this step to reinforce the motivation in following the rules. Sharing reasons behind restrictions, making the audience able to acknowledge the decision is at this stage the most powerful challenge for any society. Only the highest level of fairness in recommendation restriction can reduce the fatigue of coherence. So, I gave a look to 4 different processes. I recall them. The first, perturbation. To perturbation follows dissipation. Dissipation brings to surface new emergencies or new properties of the system, and finally a new coherence is the latest part of the process. Now we can move to the conclusion. Pandemic fatigue is a main topic for mental health. Systemic at heart, it could be considered a multifaceted existential syndrome. My investigation by focuses on the processes of the phenomenon was intended to provide a philosophical frame also for neurologists, psychologists, psychiatrists. Systemic thinking make accessible several levels of knowledge within the systemic hierarchy by gaining a unitary vision of the complexity. Throughout these lenses, pandemic fatigue, which is a topic for many disciplines, as I noticed before, well, pandemic fatigue may be understood as a systemic property, as an emergence, not as an isolated phenomenon. Thus, any approach to this discomfort should be multidisciplinary. Furthermore, grasping the dynamics of such a deep tiredness invite to look at pandemic fatigue also in positive terms, as a process of transformation whose various steps establish a new posture for the individual. I thank you very much for your attention and I wish you a great conference.